Yes, gentleman in the rear.
Hi, I want to first thank you all for your leadership. It's pretty impressive what we're able to do in Massachusetts, and certainly gives me hope for what we can do as a country. But my question is regarding our greenhouse gas emissions with respect to natural gas. We all are, I'm working very closely trying to reduce my university's greenhouse gas emissions. And in moving to gas, from oil to gas for fuel, but also in our electrical grid, our greenhouse gas reductions as a university have reduced mostly because of that fuel switching. And we're not taking account for the greenhouse gas emissions from extraction and transportation. And I want to know what we're going to do about that.
Take a shot. Yeah. So I don't know the exact date, but it's coming soon. There will be a regulatory approach on methane emissions, is what you're speaking about, fugitive emissions from fracking activity. The agency is looking very closely at that issue, not only when it comes to what happens in extraction, but what happens in transport, as you pointed out, fugitive leaks across the system. We do need to tighten up that system. The idea of gas is it's a bridging activity. Moving from, if you moved Ohio coal to gas, that's a big gain in a short time. And as I think Ken pointed out, you got to get going quicker. I mean, the carbon dioxide accumulates, so we've got to slow down as fast as we can slow down. And the quickest way to slow down is do fuel switching in some places. There is policy in place. People are working on that point, and that's where I should leave it. The AIR program is a very strong program in Washington. It's run from that place. We implement the permits, but when it comes to actual policy, I would defer to them. But I can just tell you something is in the works there, and it's clear we've got to tighten up that system.
I could just add that we in the Senate just passed a gas leaks bill to close that loop and to require gas companies to get about the business of fixing the mess that is adding to air pollution and CO2 emissions in the Commonwealth. But I think a greater question remains in terms of some of the other policy areas where there are proposals to actually bring, new gas lines through, the region, where a number of us feel as though we really don't have to head in that direction, that there are a whole range of solutions that are out there to be implemented if we only put our collective political will together and do it to get off fossil fuels altogether. There have been a couple of studies out there that, that have been done, that if you want to contact my office, we can get them for you, that shows that it can be done. And as Ken just said a few minutes ago, you only have to look at our state to see how far we've come. And if we applied the same standards across the board, it's amazing where we could be, nationally. But I don't disagree. We have a problem there. That's why we took action the other day with the gas leaks, bill. But that's just the tip of it. We have a long way to go.
So if I could just give my perspective on this as well. You raise an excellent point. UCS did a study called the gas ceiling. And the point of that study is to highlight the limitations of putting all of our eggs in the natural gas basket. Mm-hmm. I think there's a couple of things that do need to happen. I do think we need a strong federal regulation of methane leaks. I don't know if the Obama administration is going to have the bandwidth for that. I hope they will. They'll try. Another thing people are talking about is in the context of the carbon rule. For states that try to meet the performance goal that's been set for them by converting from coal to gas, do they need to offset some of that reduction by a methane leakage factor, which also may help tip the balance. So in our view, natural gas is a part of the answer, but really in the long run, renewables are the answer. The other aspect that we've been focusing a lot on is the connection to water. If you put your eggs in the natural gas basket, you're also talking about a great deal of water use, which is a big, big issue in western states. Those natural gas plants are vulnerable to being stopped in high temperatures because the EPA isn't going to let them send really hot water back into the streams, and also they may not have the water that they need for cooling. So for a variety of reasons, both environmental and economic and long-term reliability, we do strongly believe that the future is much more in renewables than natural gas over time.
Great, thank you. We have a question over here.
I'm a retired banker that has been working with the Conservation Law Foundation for the last couple of years on the financial problems of a multitude of crises that face us. And it seems to me every time I turn around, whether I'm looking at the sewering of Cape Cod or stormwater remediation or climate change adaptation or putting solar arrays on rooftops, we're faced with a financing issue for the private property owner. And I understand that the Senate is now working on an amendment of the PACE obligation concept, and that's a way of turning the cost of my rooftop solar array into a tax obligation payable over time. And that's a very desirable obligation to be financed in the money markets and bond markets of the country. And I'm wondering if that concept couldn't be expanded to cover sewering, to cover stormwater mitigation, and above all, to cover climate change adaptation by private property owners. Because without some kind of financing, I don't think we're going to get much done. And the idea behind the PACE concept is that this will allow for a very low-cost source of financing to be developed into a growing market.
I can tell you that we are looking at that, those concepts you've just talked about. I just had a forum in the southern part of my district in the town of Marion, where we had some banking institutions in the region that were there, along with 100 people in the small town of Marion that came out on our worst snowy night of the winter, to be there because they were so interested in solar and how to finance it, how we can, get it financed. I can tell you that I think a standard in not too distant future will be not only the financing of the real property, but also bankers starting to take a look at the cost of operating the home and factoring that in looking at the ability of one to pay a mortgage. And so there's a few unique solutions that have come about as a result of that. The company I mentioned earlier, Next Step Living, is doing a lot of work in this regard as well. So I'm excited about it. I think municipal power companies should have a special connection and responsibility to utilize municipal bonding to put out opportunities for solar arrays in regional neighborhood solar farms where people can pay back over a period of time from their savings to accomplish the goal of having a clean energy future, because it greens up the bottom line for all parties involved. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, I'd just speak to the point you're making about diversifying that funding concept to other sources tied to sustainability. And we've seen this issue of technology allowing homes themselves to be able to do things when it comes to wastewater and to some degree stormwater, although I think stormwater is very complicated. The more I work with it, the more complicated it gets, because you've got all the existing infrastructure you got to deal with. But all that said, I think you're on the right track. States actually have to do these things, probably enable these kinds of funding mechanisms. Can the federal government do that? It's an interesting question. But I know that he's talking about how Massachusetts is probably going to break through in that. I know that's being talked about in Rhode Island and other states. I think Connecticut has a green bank concept that's very promising. So all these ideas of financing, you're totally right. We've got to figure out how this cost can be spread. I mean, the fact is we are looking at this about generational benefit. And in financing, you look at generational, spreading this over longer periods of time so we can make all that work. And you'll hear crazy demagoguing around that, you know, and I don't understand that. The idea that, as you said, you can spread those costs over time and then finance against them and get great rates, I mean, that's all very smart.
Great, thank you. I think one more question, Judy, does that sound good? And I promise this is not a CZM plant. This is probably Curt and Ken could probably speak to this, and maybe the senator. So how can ocean and coastal planning best serve the issues of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation in New England?
Go ahead.
I can just tell you that, obviously, we were the first state to put in place the zoning of the ocean, going out from the coast out to the 3-mile limit, and we're in the process of implementing the planning around that Ken could speak a lot more specifically to in terms of what's happening in Massachusetts. I can tell you that it was unanimously supported in a bipartisan way as well in our state, because the oceans are something that impact every aspect of our economy. Certainly when you look at the South Coast region and the fishing industry, one of the largest cash ports in the country, in the South Coast, or you go up to Gloucester, where Senator Tarr, a minority leader, is up in that part of our state. We're very interested and very concerned about what we should do and what we should not do, what we should be able to move forward with, and where we should be cautious about what we're doing in terms of our oceans. And we've passed legislation to allow the office, the executive office, to move forward and zone it so that we can, look and see where we can put wind, offshore wind, where we should not. What will be a positive force in terms of fisheries, and where we will be disturbing, that species. I guess that lobster that kept showing up on the screen would have something to say about this as well. So.
Yes, he would.
Okay.
Yeah. Hey, I have just one perspective that's kind of interesting. Doing most of my advocacy work in Rhode Island, the special area management planning provisions under CZMA have been used very extensively in that state. And in advocacy, these SAMP plans have done some amazing things and can do more. And so I'm trying to educate folks at EPA about what CZMA authority can do. And in Massachusetts and Connecticut, it's a little different because those are implemented through local government, whereas in Rhode Island, it's sort of a separate government structure, regulatory structure. I'm not saying you need to do that. I want to be very clear, but I do think these planning authorities under CZMA are incredible because they can allow services, Sea Grant services, to be brought to local government in terms of resiliency and adaptation, all the challenges they have. And so there's some great examples in New England, and I'm very bullish on CZMA authority doing very important things going forward.
So, Brad, I would just add a couple of things. First of all, as we go forward and plan our resiliency, I think we've got to fundamentally take a different approach than we've taken in the past. Disaster planning in the past has always been about looking backwards, looking at the worst thing that's happened in history, and then planning for that. And I think what we're learning is all of what happened before is almost irrelevant to what's going to happen ahead. So first, start with the science and with the best models about sea level rise, and unfortunately, probably take the most conservative ones, meaning the ones that are predicting the highest impacts, and using those as a guidepost for the future. The second is, and this goes back to my experience in Plum Island, I really think we need to work on the FEMA process and the whole way in which, following up on what this gentleman said, the whole way we provide people a pathway to get their buildings and structures out of harm's way, because part of the problem with Plum Island, frankly, was that the mortgages on these homes exceeded sometimes the value. There was no ability to get any money to raise these homes, to get them out of harm's way. They were stuck. FEMA, we hoped, would help. It turned out that there was, a very, very complicated process, and I'm not even sure at the end of the day that they would have qualified. So we've really got to start making these emergency management programs working for people who want to take proactive action. Actually, Senator, I was very excited by I haven't seen your bill, because I'm out of state service now. The idea of a voluntary buyback is very encouraging. It's going to cost us much more to deal with these disasters than to get people out of harm's way, and so I think we've got to find a better way to do that.
So I have a closing point that sometimes audiences should know things you don't think matter may very well matter. And I'll just bring you to one interesting fact that's happened. Sean Donovan, who used to be the head of HUD, has moved over to be the OMB director. Sean Donovan was the point person on the Sandy response. So more than any of us here, he's probably been on the ground and seen Plum Island exaggerated by 10. And so having someone in that job thinking about these issues is going to be, I'm hopeful, can really lay a course for the next couple of years on this issue like Ken's talking about. There's nobody like OMB to get in the face of an agency and say, you got to fix some things here, folks, and reform your policies and make it work better. So that's a piece of good news you all should know in service. Sometimes presidents do interesting things, and that, I think, is one of them as we go forward.
Also, one other point, if I could, on this, because when you talk about the oceans, it really gets me going. And I have to share this with you because you're talking about a point of good news. It was an experience I had last evening. I was invited to the home of the ambassador from Portugal to the United States in Washington, D.C. And at the dinner table last evening, we had Republican congressmen, Democratic congressmen, Republican senators, and Democratic senators. And they were all there. We had the minister of Portugal for agriculture and oceans. We had the president of the Azores, Portugal, which sits in the middle of the Atlantic. And the major issue that we were all talking about, and there were legislators at my level of government from Rhode Island, Massachusetts, California, that came together. So these approximately 35 or so people were talking about the common natural resource that we share, the ocean. And we were talking about making that a priority. Everybody at that table, Republicans, Democrats, Senate, House, governments from different countries. And we were talking about it in the context of TTIPs. TTIPs is the acronym for the European trade agreement that's being negotiated now between Europe and the United States. And so I'd only put that on the table because that's something that we would not typically talk about all that much, trade agreements. But in trade agreements, things like carbon pricing can be put on the table. In trade agreements, issues around the environment can be put on the table. In trade agreements, issues around our oceans that we share can be put on the table. And so I would only add that let us not forget about our advocacy with what is going on now, knowing clearly where European nations, in particular the Western European nations, are on these issues that we all care so much about.
Great, thank you. And if you could all join me in thanking our presenters today.
That's good.